Hi, welcome to Unspoken History. My name is Keisha. Thank you for joining me today. Today I'm going to talk about the Moors, the Moorish Americans, or the Islamic Moors, or Spanish Moors, whatever you want to call them. I'm first going to read a little bit from my book, and then I'm going to read this document online. It says the story of Moorish descendants outside the U.S., but all of these places are in South America, Brazil, the Caribbean, Central America, um, where else? And then it talks about their culture, their art, their religion, and so on and so forth. Okay, so this is Amid the Twisted History, again, a book. So when I wrote this book, it was like I was discovering everything. Oh my God, there were black people in America. Oh my God, this and that. I was discovering this stuff. Oh my God, they were enslaving Americans and it wasn't Africans. When I was learning this stuff, I was just floored. Okay. And so I made this book really small because I wanted people to read it, especially people that don't normally read. And so what I tried to do was put everything in here in small portions so that you can know the information. But in order to go deeper, you have to go deeper than this because you can't. And now that I'm doing these videos, I'm finding more stuff. And when I read this, I'm like, yeah, this was 4 5 years ago because I've learned more since then. Okay, so but this is page 55. I am reading where am I starting? Okay. It was around the year 2007, 2008 when I discovered the information about a group of people who were called the Moors. They were a sect of Islam from the North African coast. I first heard of this while studying about ancient Egypt's Black Past. Everyone seemed to be searching for answers to the same questions. What about the Negro black man and woman in America? Who are they and where did they come from? The black people who have studied ancient Egypt revealed to me the truth of Pharaoh's dark complexion and the various complexions of their slaves. Arthur Kessler, in his book The 13th Tribe, and Rudolph Windsor, in his book From Babylon to Timbuktu. Let me say something about Timbuktu. When I was a kid, we used to say, "You better get away from me before I knock you to Timbuktu." I thought that was a fake place. The world is interesting. It's a real place. It was a real place. From Babylon to Timbuktu, both mention the presence of black Israelites and black Moors in Germany, France, Portugal, Spain, parts of modern day Russia, and parts of modern day Russia. During the time of Jesus' birth, Rome had been in control of Jerusalem for several decades prior to the birth of Jesus the Messiah. The Roman Empire is believed to have controlled a large portion of the continent we call Europe today. Now, because we've been moved around, I don't know where ancient Rome was. I'm just being honest because the everything looks the same. Like what's in Europe, what's in America, some of this stuff looks the same. So I don't know. But I know that Rome was in charge of Jerusalem, wherever Rome and Jerusalem was at that time. The Romans. Okay. Um, and then it says the Roman Empire is believed to have controlled a large portion of the continent we call Europe today. There is biblical evidence of the presence of Hebrews, Israelites, and Ishmaelites from the past to the present that are still living in what is now Europe. Hagar, the Egyptian, was the second wife of Abraham and mother of Ishmael. Hagar and Ishmael were sent away by Abraham upon Sarah's request. This action caused Abraham to be distressed, and God sent him comfort and assured him that Ishmael would be okay. God was going to make Ishmael a great nation. The people of the Iberian Peninsula could claim descendancy from either Ishmael or a combination of Esau and Ishmael. They are both descendants of Abraham. Ishmael's descendants are mentioned on several occasions throughout the scripture. I believe that the area around the Mediterranean Sea is home to the descendants of Ishmael. This is just me, trying to figure it out. The Moors, aka Muslims, were already well acquainted with Africa as well as the Americas. There must have been contact between Europe, Africa, and America hundreds of years before colonization. During the Muslim conquest of Spain in early 700s, began an almost 1,000 year long reign of Hebrew Ishmaelites from around 711 to 1492. These Muslims not only controlled Spain, but they moved into the interior of Europe with their religion, culture, and architecture. I can only imagine the impact the Moorish Empire had upon the world during their long reign. All accounts agree upon the time period in which Islam, aka the Moors, began their reign, began their 700-year rule of the entire Iberian Peninsula. Considering the remnants of Islam all over Europe, Africa, and America, I would say that they made a great and lasting impact on the world. It is believed by Rudolf Windsor that it was Moors and their Israelite subjects and slaves who took Spain for the Moors. I learned about the Dark Ages during the early stages of my Bible study. What I was being taught was a twisted ball of confusion. According to what I learned in church studies, it was considered a time when darkness ruled because darkness, they were dark. So darkness, okay, anyway, it had to do with their religion. According to it says the because that is because the Roman Catholic Church was not in charge of what people thought and believed. That's why they called it the Dark Ages. That's my personal opinion. This was a society of free thinkers, these Moors. These Moors Muslims were also excellent seafarers. Taking a trip to America and Africa before heading back to Europe would have been a common thing if you had the funds to do so. As I was doing my research in search of my history, I was already familiar with the term Moor or Moorish American. As a child, I had relatives and friends who claimed to be Moors, who claimed to be Moorish American. I had no idea what that meant at the time. However, I did think that they were strange. They didn't seem like, they didn't seem like anything special to me at the time because I was a child. The only difference between Negroes and Moorish Americans was the changing of their name because I knew a lot of them. I grew up with them. I knew they were children, and they had the last name Bay or L or something like that. Okay. And so, I grew up with them. We played together. We went to school together. They seemed to have more trouble with the law and increased time spent in jail after the name change than before. That was just my personal opinion. As I studied the history of the Revolutionary War, and the Indian treaties, I also looked for evidence that these black people who called themselves Moors Moors, were they present in America before Columbus? Excuse me. Before Columbus's arrival, as they had stated. While listening to lectures given by Moors, they often speak about a treaty that they have with the United States. One day, one day, as I thought, excuse me, I'm sorry. One day, I had a thought to find a plantation in Virginia with the names of slaves that sounded Arabic or Hebrew. So I was just searching to see if I could find anything. So I looked on through Virginia plantations, and there were many names like Abraham, Hannah, Mordecai, Esther. However, there was one that stood out to me the most. There was a man on a plantation in Virginia who was listed as one of the slaves. The young man's name was listed as the son of the Crete. I had no idea what to think of that, but I was sure that Crete was in the area of Spain, and therefore these Moors were telling some truth, just not all of it. And so what I said earlier in the book was that what I learned from the Moors was that all blacks in America were Moors. Well, explain to me what a Moor is. Because if you had said to me Moor meant black, then I've been like, okay. But I was being led to believe that Moors were Muslims. All Moors were, if you were considered a Moor, you were a Muslim. That's what I was being led to believe. And so that was to say that everybody was a Muslim. Well, no, because I know for sure before they taught me this that I was Israelite. That's what I learned from studying the scripture before I wrote this book. And so I knew, well, yeah, there's some truth to what you're saying, but Everybody wasn't a Moor. Muhammad just started Muslims in the year 700. What was everybody before that? Okay, so let me see. Oh, okay. I had thought to find a plantation in Virginia with the names. Okay, and I read that. Son of the Creek. I had no idea what to think of that. But I was sure that Crete was in the area of Spain, therefore these Moors were telling some truth, just not all of it. Okay, so it says maybe they are only giving information that they have been passed down to them, and that information was devoid of the whole truth. Eventually, I found a treaty that the United States made with the Barbary states of North Africa, aka the pirates. But it did not include any rights for subjects living in America. The Treaty of Tripoli was signed in 1797, consisted of the countries of Morocco, Algiers, Tunis, and Tripoli. The Moors, the Moors of North Africa. Noble Drew Ali began the first Moor science temple in America. There isn't much information out there about him. The Verdice Turner, aka the Empress Verdice Tiari, which is Washita, sorry. Turner Gostin L. Bay. That is her whole name. I'll say that again. Verdace Turner, aka the Empress Verdace Tiari, Washita Turner Gostin L. Bay, says that she was the heir to the Louisiana Territory. She's a Moor, and she said that was the land of her ancestors. Just saying. And as I mentioned before, I believe that Louisiana Territory that she's talking about used to be Egypt, and the Moors did have Egypt, and then the French got it from the Moors, and then the French gave it to the United States. I therefore had come to the conclusion that these Moorish Americans had a lot of truth in their stories about indigenous Americans being copper colored, brown, tawny, black, etc. It really doesn't matter which description is used. The point is that there were no Africans brought here to work in our fields, grow our crops in a climate unfamiliar to them. The people who came here with Europeans most likely came from Europe or Northwest Africa and could have already been familiar with this area. I think that's all I was going to read in here. Let me see. No, I wanted to read this part. This, I got a quote in here from Jack Forbes' book. Jack Forbes' book is called Africans and Native Americans: The Language of Race and the Evolution of a Red-Black People. So I got some quotes from his book in my book. Uh, I was just checking to see if I wanted to read that. Yeah. Mm. Okay, so he says we must realize that at the very beginning of the modern period, racial terms used by Iberians and acquired by the English were going to refer to mixed Africans as Negroes, or Africans without regard to their American heritage. Let me read that again. We must realize that at the very beginning of the modern period, racial terms used by Iberians and acquired by the English we're going to refer to mixed Africans as Negroes, or Africans without regard for their American heritage. Now, if everybody is black, brown, tawny, swarthy, I cannot look at people and say, oh, well, they necessarily look African, because some people on the north coast, the west coast, and parts of the east coast, like in Kenya, we look the same. And that's one thing Jack Forbes said, is that the people, that's the part I'm getting ready to read. Forbes writes, um, this was done on the account that the people from the West African coast had very similar features to the American Indians. So if during the conquest, when they came over in the 1400s, if they shipped people out to the Caribbean, to Europe, and to Africa, those people, they're still there. So they intermixed in with the people that were there. And so, what do you have? The same mix: Ishmaelites and Israelites over there, Ishmaelites and Israelites over here. But there were more than just that over here, because, like I said, the Mongols, the Acadians. There are people right now on the East Coast that says that they're Acadian. What, we gonna tell them that they're not? Probably in the Caribbean too. All right, Forbes right. African peoples who might not only have the features of the Gulf of Guinea, but also every conceivable combination of Central African, Ibero African, Afro Arabic, and American African mixtures. He also states that many Africans from the Sahel and Savannah Belt, as well as from parts of East Africa, sometimes resemble American African hybrids, with various combination of high cheekbones, prominent aquiline noses, semi-wavy to bushy hair, oriental eye shapes. It's more probable that the colonizers were traveling to America, brought with them Hebrew and Arabic and Spanish speaking folk as servants, slaves, or fellow believers in the Catholic faith. Okay, so I wanted to read this article from Solent.org, History of Moorish Americans. The story of Moorish descendants. Okay, so first they have the Brazilian development from 800 to 300 to 1300 CE. Early Mandinka settlements. Remember if you didn't watch my video about Alex Haley plagiarizing roots, where I mentioned that his family, that Mandinka warriors were already in South America, all through South America, and they were Moors. And his family apparently descend from there. Here it is again. Here it is. It says early Mandinka settlements. Archaeological findings documented by Wilkins, Mystery of Ancient South America, from 800 to 900 CE, whatever that means, okay, because I'm sure these numbers are messed up too. But the Bahia coastal settlement, port settlements, written records in via script quotes from 1754 document a city in Minas Gerais, well laid out with superb buildings, obelisks, and statues. Now, when I was reading in, what was I reading about the Mongol conquest of America? In one of those videos, the author of the book says that there was only two major cities in all of the Americas. That was Cusco and Montezuma. Everything else was rude and savage. Not according to this, and not according to many other writers and historians and archaeologists. So it says that from 900 to 1000 CE, archaeological evidence, urban centers with its Islamic architecture, water systems matching North African design, astronomical observations, and agricultural systems. Can you imagine? Right down there in Brazil, in the Caribbean, talking about Haiti and Hispaniola. I guess that's what the Dominican Republic is called. Okay. Columbus Journal and La Casa's document, pre 1492 evidence. Black Guyanan traders, Islamic prayer sites, trade centers, and maritime ports. Technology transfer from archaeological records. Navigation techniques. Archaeological methods matching Moorish practices. Now this is in the Caribbean from 800 to 1400 CE. Architectural similarities to North African design. Now they would give this credit to the Mongols, because, like, we could say, well, it's okay now. Peru had modern civilization. The ancient Peruvians and the ancient Mexicans, they had civilizations. Nobody else except Europe. Well, now you can find a lot of information on China and the Mongol Empire and their civilization and their technology and whatnot. But when it comes to people that are brown, they didn't have no technology. They didn't have no civilization. Stop it, okay? Because how old is the Bible? How old is Babylon? How old is the first Tower of Babel? People have had technology and been writing and doing things for thousands of years. It did not just start with Europeans. It didn't just start with the Moors or anybody else from Europe or North Africa. Technology, civilizations were all over the planet. Almost every civilization worshiped the sun and the moon and the stars. Okay. The Central American presence, Panama. Sources of historical records of Balboa and contemporary studies. The Darien region, the Mandinga communities established, Islamic cultural centers, trade networks, and agricultural development. Mm, mm, mm. The Andean region, where is this? Ecuador, Peru, development, sources, archaeological studies, and historical documents. 900 to 1100 CE, mountain settlements. Islamic style fortifications, systems matching Moorish engineering, agricultural terracing similar to North African methods, trade routes, stations. Okay, hold on, I gotta get something. Uh, okay, you can stay down there. So I want to read something. This is, I talked about this in another video too. The pristine myth, the landscape of America before 1492. So, um, it says there is substantial evidence, however, that the Native American landscape in the early 16th century was a humanized landscape almost everywhere. Populations were large, forest compositions had been modified, grasslands had been created, wildlife disrupted, and erosion was severe in places. Earthworks, roads, fields, settlements were ubiquitous. Ubiquitous. Sorry. With Indian depopulation, with Indian depopulation in the wake of the old world, in the wake of old world disease and shipping out and murdering, the environment recovered in many areas. A good argument can be made that the human presence was less visible in 1750 than it was in 1492. This is an article called The Pristine Myth. I don't know if you can see that. You can find that online. It's free online. Okay. All right. So that was Ecuador and Peru. It says from archaeological records, Lake Titicaca. So now I read this Lake Titicaca. It wasn't called, when I read it in the Mongol Conquest of America, it says Titicaca. This one says Titicaca. Quote, okay, I'm not even going to try to read that word. Mandinka inscriptions found dating circa 1100 to 1200 CE. Location, Coatry Island. Okay, so it says trade routes and networks. Maritime routes, sources. These are L. Idris's maps in archaeology. So this person was a historian, I think. L. Idris, A L dash IDRISI apostrophe S. His map and archaeological evidence. Atlantic current. So they knew which way the waters went. That's why Jack Forbes says in his book that it was that Merriman, who is he was a map maker. But anyway, because of the water currents, he said that it was easier to go from America to Europe than for you to come from Europe to America. The current would just flow you right on over there. Somebody went from New York to Spain in 55 days on the current in a little old boat. Just saying. Okay. It says maritime routes from L. Idris's maps and archaeological evidence. West African coast, Caribbean. So they had a route to the west, from West Africa to the Caribbean, from Brazil to North Africa, from the Caribbean to Central America, documented ports and stopping points, river systems, Amazon network, coastal ports, inland trading ports, river navigation markers. All of this stuff was already here. All of this so-called building that was supposed to be going on during these 500 years of war. Let me say 400 years of war, because the only people that's being warred against in America are the Negroes right now. Well, back then, because right now it's everybody. But so these shipping ports, these lighthouses, these buildings with domes like Moorish architect, all this stuff. And then there's old Catholic, well, I ain't gonna say Catholic church. There are old churches in America, very, very, very old. Did nobody have no technology to build those things? I used to believe it too, until I started looking, and you go, wait, you see the size of that stone? What horse and buggy moved that? Who put that giant steeple all the way hundreds of feet up in the air? Really? No, 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 no. But anyway, you can believe whatever you want. I did. It says cultural preservation systems. I'm not going to be able to read it all because I am running out of time. That's how my system works. So yeah, just wanted to talk about them Moors. They just wasn't lying. They were in America before colonization. And just because it said Moor or Muslim, black people were in America. They didn't have to be Moors. Black, brown, tawny, swarthy, copper colored Americans. Copper color is a brown with a red undertone. Sort of, well, I'm not quite as brown, but I'm red. And my husband is brown and he's got a red undertone. Yeah, that's that copper color, like pennies. That's the color the Americans wear. And so, and also in that publication I was just reading, the Prestige Myth, it says that as you moved around the plains, the Negroes got darker and darker. So when Jack Forbes is talking about the mix of African and Indian, he's talking about maybe the other type of Indian, not the Negro Indians. Okay, because there were many people in America. Because if you mix with us, we're just gonna look the same. Probably have a different nose, maybe a skinnier nose like the people over there in the Middle East. But that brown skin and kinky hair, anybody could be mistaken for a Negro, which was why they came up with the grandfather clause in the late 1800s, because they knew they were getting ready to take away people's rights. And these prominent blacks wanted to make sure that and the whites wanted to make sure too, that they could vote. So who knows who it was? It could have been blacks and whites writing that grandfather clause. But I'll read about that in another video. But they wrote this clause so that after the Civil War, when they were ready to deny people their right to vote, these people can point back to before the Civil War to a grandfather who was never enslaved, who had the right to vote. And if they were able to point back to a grandfather that had the right to vote, then they got grandfather right on in. So I'll talk about that in the next video or the next couple of videos. Thanks for watching. Have a good day. Please like, share, subscribe, and leave a comment if you want to. Thank you.